Hi all, if you're like me and can't wait for the New Zealand region to come live, then migrating resources between regions is something that you may want to consider. So let's take a look at Azure Resource Mover and architecting across multi-regions today. So if you had said 5 years ago that Microsoft was bringing an Azure region into New Zealand, I would have said, yeah, right, good to dream, but not going to be a reality. It's 2022. We know the New Zealand North region is coming sometime in the mid 2023. It's definitely coming. So the investment that Microsoft are making for New Zealand is just the economy and adapting for skills is just great. So now's an opportunity to prepare for it. Can't wait. So just to recap, today we're going to be talking about Azure Resource Mover and migrating resources between regions. Thanks to the Microsoft Reactor for coming from Sydney to New Zealand to a 3-day pop-up event, just talking about AI, machine learning, Azure New Zealand North in Auckland. So yeah, was really fun, and this is a session that I did on day 3, but recorded at home due to technical difficulties. So let's get into it. So who am I? My name is Luke Murray. I'm a technical consultant at IT Partners in Hamilton, New Zealand, Waikato. So I primarily deal with pre-sales architecture for clients, working on the cloud adoption strategy for the company and clients as well. You can scan the QR code below to get a link to all my social media, including my GitHub account, which has the repository of these slides. So the QR code will also be on the last slide, so you can wait to see that. But yeah, I've got numerous Microsoft certifications and newly minted MVP as of May this year. So yeah, exciting times. So today we're going to discuss what is an Azure region anyway, just to recap, and how can I migrate already existing resources. So what is a region? There's a few people out there that still think an Azure region is a single data center running somewhere in the world. But a region is bound to a geography. So for example, Australia East, Southeast, 2 separate geographic regions within Australia. They're 2 separate regions. A region now also is made up of availability zones. So they're 3 separate data centers which have their own independent cooling, storage, networking, and power supply. So 3 completely separate data centers make up an availability zone, which then makes up a region. So for New Zealand North, as an example, we're getting an availability zone, so 3 data centers, and that makes up the entire region. And each data center is completely separate and independent, but then connected by interconnected fiber links between them. So you get a lot of resiliency when deploying to zonal resources. So a region is a geographic, like West US, East US, 2 separate, completely different regions, and each one made up of 3 separate data centers. So let's keep calm and migrate it in Azure with Azure Resource Mover. So why would you want to migrate resources? So one of the examples is taking advantage of new Azure region expansions. So for example, New Zealand North, so migrating services from what normally we would be using Australia for. So we'd be migrating services from Australia to New Zealand. Increasing the availability and resilience by moving to regions that have Azure availability zones from regions that don't support it. This is becoming less so as Microsoft is going back to previous regions that may only have 1 or 2 data centers and are now adding a third to make up that triangle per factor of 3 for availability zones. Meeting residency requirements for data and compliance. So for example, you might be in the health industry and patient data is not allowed offsite or offshore. You might want to move your resources into regions that better support that. And consolidating workloads for mergers and acquisitions. So you might have just acquired a company and you want to move those resources into the same region as you. And the cost of resources in one region may be cheaper than another. So you might have dev test resources, for example, that you still want to run, but you're not overly concerned about the latency or data requirements. You might find that running them in the US, for example, is cheaper than running them in Australia East. You can use Azure Resource Mover to migrate those resources as well to just get the best bang for your buck, depending on your business requirements. So, as with anything, there are risks when you migrate resources between regions. So, for example, migrating resources between region, like your source and destination region, can pose a risk of an extended outages. Your workloads are often made of multiple services. So, for example, you might have an application server that's reliant on an Azure SQL database, separate tools, separate mechanisms to migrate them. There's a risk that you might not quite understand how the replication's working or planning. There's interdependencies. So for example, Azure Virtual Machine is reliant on an Azure network interface, and could be a storage account or virtual network or even the resource group. So just the interdependencies between resources are sometimes not often understood. And the testing and rollback of these scenarios and migrations can be quite daunting, especially if you just want to replicate something to another region, test it, and then either roll it back or confirm that, yep, everything's okay. So let's proceed. So what are the benefits of Azure Resource Mover? So Azure Resource Mover helps you orchestrate your move within a highly secure and encrypted Azure environment. It allows you to validate your move. So for example, you can move a resource group, move a virtual machine from your source to your destination region, do some testing, and if you're happy with it, cool, all good. If you're not happy with it, you can revert that change, delete the resources in the destination region and go back to running your source resources without them ever being touched. You can streamline your move process. So Azure Resource Mover will identify the dependencies between your resources, allowing you to better make informed decisions on what resources to move and when. And you can plan and test your move multiple times. You can stage your move. So Azure Resource Mover is a 6-step process. We're going to get into those steps shortly, but you can stage every part of that migration quite easily, and all through a single pane of glass. So it's reducing the manual touch points and intervention that you need to do for every resource. And overall, it can reduce your overall time of your move from months to weeks or even days based on the resources and the data that you're migrating across regions. So just to recap, Azure Resource Mover gives you a unified experience to move different types of resources using the same single pane of glass, single portal. You can select multiple resources and delete them, migrate them, then delete the source resources all in one step. Azure Resource Mover will validate the dependencies, and you can also adjust the SKU, the name, the availability zone of your resources during your move. So for example, you might be just doing some testing. So as part of your move, you might downsize a virtual machine to the secondary or the destination region, which reduces your cost, but also you're still running the same SKU size in the source region. So you can downsize if you want to do some testing, and then you can upsize when it's time to go live, all during that move process. So there are some restrictions to what Azure Resource Mover can currently move as of May 2022. Let's get into what resources we can move. So Azure SQL databases can be migrated, but not Azure SQL servers. Azure Virtual Networks, Azure Virtual Machines can be moved and associated disks, but not unattached or unassociated disks snapshots. So your disks need to be attached to a Azure Virtual Machine when you go and migrate them. SQL Elastic pools, load balancers, public IPs, resource groups, network security groups, network interfaces, Azure availability sets, and Azure storage accounts are coming in the next 6 to 9 months. So well ahead of our new data center region here in New Zealand. So make it a lot easier for us. So as I alluded to earlier, Azure Resource Mover is a 6-step process. So step 1 is select resources. So you select the resources that you want to move. Step 2 is validate dependencies. So Azure Resource Mover will then go and validate those dependencies on your resources that you want to move. So for example, Azure SQL database will have a dependency of an Azure SQL server. A virtual machine will have a dependency of a network interface or the disks. Step 3, prepare to move. So for stateless resources such as a resource group, an Azure Resource Manager or ARM template will be created to stand up that resource group in the destination region. If your resource is stateful, so a virtual machine or a SQL database, then Azure Site Recovery will then start to replicate the disk to the destination region. And if it's an Azure SQL database, geo-replication will occur. We can see that in the demo that we'll run through shortly. Step 4 is initiate move. So this is when you're happy, your resources are prepared, you're happy to either do a test or do your migration. Just note that this step does depend on the resource types. It can occur an outage, so when you do initiate a move, prepare for an outage during this window. And this is when your copy is stood up in your secondary region. So for example, a virtual machine, the source region will be deallocated, and then the destination region, the VM will be started. And then step 5 is commit or discard your move. So if you're happy with your move after you've done your testing as part of the previous step, you can commit it, which will stop the replication, and the latest version of your resource is in the destination region. And finally, step 6 is to delete your source. So using Azure Resource Mover, if you're completely happy, you can go and delete your source resources in the source region. So enough talking, let's start to just get into a demo about Azure Resource Mover. So for this demo, we're going to migrate resources between Australia East and West US 3. I was going to use Australia Southeast, but due to some restrictions in my Visual Studio subscription, so quotas and resources that I could deploy, I ran into some issues, so we're going to be deploying to West US 3 instead. So what resources are we actually going to migrate as part of this demo? So we're going to migrate Azure Virtual Network, Azure SQL Database, and an Azure Virtual Machine and its associated dependencies such as resource group, network interfaces, and managed disks. Note the migration for these resources took roughly about an hour end to end. So the demo was pre-recorded and I cut down the video in order to fit within the session limit for the reactor days, and we're just going to go through the same thing here. So let's take a look. So here you can see that we've got a number of resources, different type of resources, and we're going to have a look and see that we've got 11 in Australia East at the moment and 1 in West US 3. So the one in West US 3 is a SQL server that I've stood up because SQL servers aren't supported as part of the move, but we need something to migrate the SQL database to. So we just opened up Azure Resource Mover and we're selecting our source region, which is going to be Australia East, and then our destination region, which is going to be West US 3. Now you can't have the same source and destination region, for example, to move within availability sets. They have to be separate. And now we're going to select the SQL database as a resource and the virtual machine. We're going to let Azure Resource Manager find those dependencies later. Then we're going to proceed. It will go and explain the 6-step process. One thing to mention is that system managed service identity will be created. So you either need owner rights to the subscription or contributor with user admin request role in order to grant rights to create that system managed identity. Now those resources will be added to Azure Resource Mover, and then we validate the dependencies of those resources. Once those dependencies have been validated, we then add them. Now, using Azure Resource Mover, you can easily see which resources are linked to what dependencies quite easily. So, for example, we can have a look at this network interface, and it's a dependency of the virtual machine, which is called Azure Move Demo. So we're just going to add those dependent resources into Azure Resource Mover. And they've been added. So now that the resources have been added, we're just going to validate the dependencies of those resources that were dependent of the other resources, just so Azure Resource Mover completely knows that any missing dependencies have been added. So they're all pretty much in the prepare pending stage. So if we have a look at one of the errors, we can see, for example, the SQL database. We're unable to move it because the SQL instance has an unassigned target ID. So that's referring to a metadata change that we need to do. For example, the move of SQL Server is not supported, so we need to map an existing SQL Server, which is what we're going to do now. So we can go in, select our West US 3 SQL Server, save and validate those changes, and that will map the metadata to allow us to migrate our SQL database to the destination region. Now that's gone, we can, for example, certain dependencies need to be migrated before others. Most example will be Azure Resource Groups. So we're going to go in and we're going to change the name of the Azure Resource Group to match our naming standard. So virtual machines - web US3 RG in the destination region. We're going to save and validate those changes, and that will allow us to rename and create the West US 3 resource group in the other region according to our naming standard. Resource groups are usually something that you need to do first before other resources, so you'd still need to know what dependencies are between resources, but it makes it easier. And here you can see with the Azure Virtual Machine, we can change the name. So we're going to change it from Azure Move Demo AUE Prod VM to SUS3. We can change the SKU, so this will be the SKU that it will be in the destination region. If there's availability set, we can set it. We can also change the availability zone that it gets deployed to in the region, in the destination region as well. So we're going to save and validate those changes. Which is successful. And we're going to go and update the name of the network security group as well to match our naming standard of Azure Move Demo West US3 Prod VM NSG, and then save and validate those changes. And for the network interface, we can change the name. We can also enable or disable accelerated networking. We can change the subnet of the NIC as well, and whether it's a primary or a secondary network interface. So we're going to save and validate those changes. So depending on the resource type that we're going to move, there's actually quite a lot to configure, or quite a lot that you can configure as part of the migration, which makes it a lot easier, especially when you've got naming standards or you want to move something to a different subnet. And we're just going to go into the public IP. So as you can see, there's DNS name label, FQDN, SKU. We're going to, even if you get something wrong with Azure Resource Mover, so for example, we're putting in the FQDN of Azure Move Demo.cloudapp.azure.com in the DNS name field. Now Azure Resource Mover will do a lookup. It'll do a validation of the template. It's not happy, something's wrong. And as you can see here, the domain name is invalid. It does not meet the conditions of the deployment. So we'll just swap those around. So the FQDN goes in the FQDN field, and then the DNS name label goes in the name label field, and then validate and accept those dependencies. So Azure Resource Mover does a really good job around error messaging as well, and validation. So we're just going to update the virtual network. So West US3 Prod VNet. We could have changed the address space as well in the subnets, but we're just going to leave those as is, and then validate and save those dependencies. Then we're quickly just going to change the resource group name for the virtual network, save and validate those dependencies. And now we're going to select the resource groups, hit prepare, which will start creating the templates. And once they're prepared, we will then initiate the move, which will then create the resource groups in the secondary region or the destination region. And finally, we'll commit the move. So as mentioned earlier, resource groups are something that you would want to prepare, move, and commit before you look at moving other resources, because they're dependent on moving other resources. So now that they're moved, they're in a delete source pending state. So we're just going to unselect those, select the SQL Server, and then commit the move. So this is just committing the SQL Server metadata change. So SQL Server is now pointing towards the West US 3 SQL Server that's already been created. We needed to do that before we can move the SQL database. So now all the resources are in a prepare pending state. SQL database, the virtual machine, and we're just going to validate and prepare those. So Azure Resource Mover has different move types depending on how, like, the resources and how they're moved. So this will help document exactly what step and what changes are being done. So during the prepare step, Azure Site Recovery is being stood up for the virtual machine disks, and for the Azure SQL database, geo-replication is starting to be prepared and enabled as part of this prepare step. So we've now got a SQL database that's now sitting in West US 3, which is a replica type of geo. So this has just started replicating across from the Australia East region, and as you can see here, we've got a primary, which is in Australia East, and then our secondary geo replica is in West US 3, which is readable. Now we're going to have a look at replicated items under the recovery service vault. So this is Azure Site Recovery being used to replicate the disks for the Azure Virtual Machine into West US 3. It's worth noting that the Azure Virtual Machine needs to be on for the move to occur, as it relies on the mobility agent by Azure Site Recovery to be installed and its operating system aware. So now that the prepare step's been completed, we want to actually initiate the move of those resources and stand them up. So we're going to select the resources, and then it will validate the dependencies, validate everything's okay, and start the move process. So the prepare and the move steps are the two longest steps because it's relying on the resources, the data to be replicated to the destination region. As you can see with Azure Site Recovery, we're now initiating the test failover. So for example, our VM in Australia East has now been stopped and deallocated automatically by Azure Site Recovery and Azure Resource Mover. And the West US 3 now has a virtual machine that's just been stood up and running. So now we can do our testing. It's got a new public IP address with a new FQDN. So you can't keep the same FQDN or public IP address because every Azure region has its own IP address ranges so you can't keep the same IP address from one region to another in most cases, but DNS helps you here because you could easily update your DNS records. Right, we're happy with the change. So we're just going to commit them. So what this will do is this will replicate any changes between the move and the commit stage. And as you can see here, West US 3 is now our main SQL database. And Australia East has just become the read replication. And that replica will then be stopped. So yeah, West US 3 is now the primary. The replica state is readable in the secondary region, and because we've committed that move, we no longer need the replica anymore. We're happy with the resources in West US 3, so the geo-replication has been removed. Now that all resources have pretty much been moved, we can now delete the source resources. If we need to. And so it's as simple as selecting them and then click on yes to confirm that yes, we can delete those resources. And then Azure Resource Mover will delete those resources. So let's just take a look. So West US 3 resources, we only had one resource when we started, now we've got 10, and the resources in Australia East, we've only got 6, which is resources that were there before I migrated, before I moved. So we've successfully moved all our resources from Australia East to West US 3. So another thing to keep in mind when using Azure Resource Mover is you can have multiple moves happening at the same time. So in my demo, I've just selected everything and did the Azure SQL database, the virtual machine, the virtual network, all as part of one move. But you can take more of a service-orientated view or migration of it. So for example, you might want to have your shared SQL databases migrated one day or 1 week, and then you might have your Azure virtual machines migrated as part of a separate step or another week. You can have different migrations happening between regions, and Azure Resource Mover gives you a nice clean move across region dashboard. So in this example, we can see that we've got one subscription, 3 source regions, 3 destination regions. We can see our migration from Australia East to West US 3, and we can see the resources by move status. So for example, we've got 9 source delete resources pending in this case, but we could easily clap that if we had other resource migrations being moved as well and see it all from this view. So some items to note as part of migrating resources between regions using Azure Resource Mover. So you can't move individual disks. However, if the disks are attached to a virtual machine, then you can move them. You can migrate encrypted virtual machines, but it needs manual intervention to copy the keys from the key vault in the source region to a key vault in the destination region. You can move other resources to another subscription, however it's after they've been moved to a destination region. You can't do it as part of a single step process. So for example, migrating resources to another region and another subscription as part of the move process, not currently supported, but you can do it after it's been migrated to the destination region. You also can't migrate paired virtual networks across subscriptions or across regions. You need to remove the pairing first and then re-add it once it's back in the destination region. So make sure that you're quoting required services for your destination region. So for example, your CPU quotas, your SQL database resources have all been accounted for before you look at moving. So make sure that you've got enough CPU cores, for example, in the destination region, and those services enabled on your subscription before you look at migrating them to avoid any issues. Azure Resource Mover can also be moved to migrate Azure Virtual Desktop Session Hosts. Essentially, they're just Azure Virtual Machines across regions. So, and then you can re-key them into different host pools as well. So, makes it a lot easier when you're looking at migrating Azure Virtual Desktop resources from a region that may not have had a metadata for the host pool, and then now it does. Now you can migrate them to be closest to the end user using Azure Resource Mover. And DNS records can be key to reducing the complexity and interruption as part of your migration. I know DNS gives us issues sometimes, but it's not always DNS, and sometimes it's a lot easier for the end users and ourselves by using DNS and CNAMEs as part of the migration. So, and there are PowerShell commandlets, such as the new Azure Resource Mover move collection, which will allow us to easily script and automate a lot of the migrations. You can use this to create your own scripts and get some really good feedback from the Azure Arm and Fabric on your migration as well, as long as additional reports that you can create with your scripts. So everything that I've showed you in the Azure portal as part of our quick demo can be automated using PowerShell, which is a plus. So we're going to quickly finish off by looking at architecting for multiple regions using a very quick high-level overview of the load balancer options. So there are some resources that you can't migrate across regions, so you will need to architect for them. So for example, you may have an application web app, and you want to just architect, so if one region goes down, another one will take over. There's some different tools we can look at here. So we're just going to quickly run through, at a very high level, the multi-region load balancers to consider as part of your multi-region architecture. So a tip is the Azure portal and Microsoft have given you, if you go into the Azure portal, you click on search, start typing in load balancers. You can see load balancing, help me choose, because there's a plethora of resources and load balancers. Sometimes it's really hard to figure out what type of load balancer, whether it's a layer 7 or layer 4 load balancer you may need as part of your migration, and which one to choose from. So if you start typing in load balancer, click load balancing, help me choose in the Azure portal, you'll be given this interface and really quick questionnaire. So for example, does your application use HTTP or HTTPS? There's a couple of different load balancer options. So for example, application gateway, front door, load balancer, and traffic manager. And if you fill out those questionnaires, then you'll get something like this. So for example, both of these are cross-region. So for example, in our first scenario, we've gone, does your application use HTTP or HTTPS? We've selected no. Is your application internet facing? Yes. Is your application deployed to multiple regions? Yes. So they've recommended Traffic Manager as a DNS-based load balancer, which is globally available between regions. So you would have your Traffic Manager in front, and then separate load balancers. For example, so a globally available Traffic Manager that your DNS records are pointing towards, and then that Traffic Manager is pointing towards 2 load balancers. So one would be in Australia East, and then one in West US 3 or New Zealand North, and then behind that load balancer will be your services. The second option that we looked at, we've gone, does your application use HTTP or HTTPS? We've gone yes. Is your application public or internet facing? Yes. Is your application deployed across multiple regions? Yes. And do you want performance acceleration? Yes. And do you want SSL offloading or application layer processing as part of your request? Yes. So these are more web-based workloads in layer 7. So HTTP, HTTPS. So we've got Azure Front Door, which is a global layer 7 load balancer, which has SSL offloading. So Azure Front Door will sit in front of your two or more regions, and then underneath that will be an Azure Application Gateway, which will then have redirect to your backend pools or your backend web servers. So when you're architecting across multiple regions, Traffic Manager for non-HTTP services, and then Azure Front Door for HTTP services, HTTP and HTTPS services, so 80 and 443 are really key here. So this is just a high-level diagram of what it would look like with Traffic Manager. So these are TCP, UDP-based applications. So your internet or on-premises requests are coming into Traffic Manager, and then Traffic Manager is either sending you to Australia East in Azure Load Balancer or Australia Southeast, another Azure Load Balancer, and here you can either easily fail over between regions or send the users to the closest region for them. So even with New Zealand North coming into play, you might want to keep some of your resources in Australia East as an example, and then you could easily increment and add New Zealand North into this type of architecture. So yeah, really good, and keep in mind, and especially because the New Zealand North region is another year or so away, it's a really good chance to start looking at architecting your applications in a way that makes it quite easy to migrate between regions, not only for yourself but your end users. So here's some additional resources to help you learn more about Azure and Azure regions. So these are a couple of Microsoft documentation. Essentially, the support for moving Azure VMs between regions pretty much goes through the step-by-step process we went through in the demo. The Azure Architecture Center, again, if you want to know more about multi-region architecture, the Azure Architecture Center is key for sample patterns that may occur, load balancing options, Azure geographies, Azure storage, redundancy, and cross-region pairing, replication pairings. And I put together an awesome Azure Architecture GitHub list, which lists a whole bunch of Microsoft and third-party community resources that are just awesome. I think there's over 50 links now, so definitely check that out. And yeah, if you want to know more about Azure Resource Mover, then there's the Azure Resource Mover page. There's docs, there's the azure.microsoft.com, there's a couple of videos, so Azure Unblogged, Azure Resource Mover, Azure Friday videos, and there's a Azure Resource Mover whiteboarding video for you to take a look at as well. So if you need help or there's other resources that aren't covered as part of Azure Resource Mover that you want to look at migrating between regions, then reach out to the Microsoft Fast Track program of work called Azure Region Portability, or ARPP. So they can help you coordinate tools, resources, teams to help facilitate your resources from one region to another. Just see your local Microsoft account manager for eligibility into that program. So thank you. Bring on New Zealand North. It was a really good 3-day event at Microsoft New Zealand in Auckland. Thank you to the Microsoft Reactor team from coming over to New Zealand from Australia. I hope we can do it again. Scan the QR code to visit my socials, add me on LinkedIn or Twitter, take a look at the presentation slide deck on a GitHub repository called Presentations, and thank you for, I hope I earned the privilege of your time. Thank you.